Welcome. So my presentation is called Systematic Review of Quebec University's Policies Addressing First Peoples, Transformative Change or Neo-Colonialism. My name is Marka Handfield, and I'm a community psychology student based in Jojagi. So first, here is an official land acknowledgement developed by First Peoples. However, I will make my own as it's important to contextualize and personalize land acknowledgements. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm occupying the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka as a settler. So I recognize the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation as the custodians of the lands and waters I occupy. And as a settler, recognizing past, present, and ongoing relations means recognizing the privileges I get from colonialism. So for me, this means redistributing my privileges and resources. It's with this in mind that I approach the Circle of First Nations in my university. So offering them my tools as a community student psychologist, so especially around research. And they're the ones who gave me this question of what are the policies addressing First Peoples in universities and what are their impacts. So for the presentation plan, you can scan this code with your phone, or you can use this link if you want to download the PowerPoint. You'll see there's a few bonus slides that I won't go over, but if you want to read them, you're welcome to. I added a few quizzes to make it more interactive. So if you download the PowerPoint as well, you can maybe write in it and send it to me after or something like this. I'm using automatic CCs. You can't see them because in this version, it doesn't work with the recorded, so you won't see them, but I will have a transcript, so you can email me and I can give it to you. So for the presentation plan, it's pretty standard. We'll start with relevance, method, results, then discussion and key takeaways. So as you might have heard from my accent, I'm from the French-speaking part of so-called Canada, so Quebec. Here is a map with the 11 different nations. In recognition of the land, I will use the Kanien'kehá:ka terms instead of the colonial terms to refer to places. So instead of saying so-called Canada, I'll use Turtle Island, even though Turtle Island doesn't only refer to the borders now known as Canada. In this context, I'll use it to refer specifically to Canada. Jojagi means Montreal, and I didn't find the term for the province of Quebec. We'll use the settler term of Quebec. So why does this matter? Well, the absence of institutional policies addressing First Peoples specifically in universities reproduces colonialism through assimilation or exclusion, as First Peoples have the additional burden of learning and adapting to dominant codes, thoughts, languages, cultures, and worldviews. They're literally disadvantaged for being Indigenous. However, institutional actions toward First Peoples often reproduce those colonial dynamics, even if they seem positive. So they can become a form of neoliberalism as they maintain the status quo, but also make actual change even harder. So here I use the word neoliberalism to refer specifically to a non-historical perspective of current inequalities, promoting the myth that we all had equal chances and power. So this allows us to ignore how the present is shaped by relations of power, privilege, and ongoing colonialism, all of those persisting in our institutions. So what I want to highlight is that performative and superficial actions are not only useless, but are actually harmful. So this is documented for EDI. So EDI is equity, diversity, inclusion. I will use the term EDI. So this is documented for EDI institutional actions, for example, where resistance from more privileged people actually increase following inadequate institutional actions. So considering the importance of institutional policies, as well as the risks, a critical analysis of institutional actions seems necessary to guide us towards a real transformative change. So the question becomes, are current institutional actions transformative or a form of neo-colonialism? So for the method, the objective was to identify policies concerning First Peoples in universities. So there are 19 universities in Quebec, 3 of them being English speaking. Policies refers to university-wide policies, so that's why I'll use the term institutional policy to refer to that aspect. For the procedure, the keywords were research on each university's website using their toolbar, their research bar. The first 50 results were consulted as well as each links and references until saturation. The keywords were also researched in Google to avoid biases due to differences in the research engines. And emails were also sent to each university. So in recognition of my settler identity and to avoid reproducing colonial dynamics by centering Western methods and knowledge, the holistic indigenous framework was used, which was developed by Pigeon, a scholar of Mi'kmaq ancestry working on Turtle Island. So this framework allows to analyze institutional actions in response to indigenization from an indigenous perspective with the limit that I'm a settler. And this framework centers the 4 R's of respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. The framework serves to distinguish between a checklist approach and a transformative approach, so which is our objective. So how I did this is by integrating 2 analyses that Pigeon realized with this framework on universities on Turtle Island. So this led to the formulation of criterias and conditions, so 32 criterias and 3 conditions that you will see in the table. So criterias refer to types of actions, but beyond types of actions, participation, specificity, and accountability, and the engagement of adequate resources are conditions for any meaningful institutional action that centers the 4 R. So for the results, none of the 19 universities in Quebec have an institutional policy addressing First Peoples. Here we can see the 19 universities represented. 4 of them have no institutional actions mentioning First Peoples. However, First Peoples were identified in action plans. So there were 2 types, either EDI, so equity, diversity, inclusion, which refer to 4 groups, so women, First Peoples, disabled, and visible minorities. And the other type was First People specific. So 10 universities only mention First Peoples in EDI action plans, and none of them address First Peoples adequately, considering the 3 conditions I mentioned. Which means that only 5 universities have action plans specific to First Peoples, also meaning that the great majority, so 14 out of 19, have no institutional action specific to First Peoples. So if we go to the criteria, as I mentioned, so here are the 32 criteria, we can see the 5 universities with action plans specific to First Peoples. Here we have 2 of the English-speaking universities, so there's 3 English-speaking universities out of 19, and 2 of them are in this table, represented by the little flag to show that they're English-speaking. So you can pause here to take the time to look at the criteria. What's important to mention is that checking the box doesn't mean that the action is done, but simply mean that the action was mentioned in the action plan. So the ability for this mention to transform into action depends on the respect of the 3 conditions that I'll show further in the next table. But first, what are your first impressions when you look at the chart? So here we can see the conditions. Here are the indicators of that allowed to determine the score. I represented them with colors to make it clearer. So red is the worst and green is the best. Here we have 2 light greens, which are 2 specific situations in between partial and high. So for McGill, some actions were extremely specific, while some were not specific. And for UCAT, the general level of participation was at 4, but some actions implied co-governance, which is a much higher level. So I wanted to highlight those differences. So if we go at participation first, we can see that 3 universities reach a level of participation beyond tokenism, so using Einstein's ladder. So that's Laval, Concordia, and UCAT, with Concordia presenting the highest level. For specificity, Concordia again presents the highest level, and we have 2 different patterns, with 2 universities being specific only around the actions, so University of Montreal and UCAT, and 2 universities being specific only around governance and accountability. Finally, there's 2 universities that are engaging sufficient resources in their action plans. So now if we look at the full table, what I want to highlight is the difference between when we look only at the X's and now when we consider the conditions. So maybe if you compare your first impressions to now, for example, looking at University of Montreal. So respect of the conditions are much more important than the criteria. So even if you say all the right things, so even if you have all the X's in terms of saying the things, if you don't have the conditions to ensure those words are put into action, it's meaningless. So this illustrates the purpose of the holistic Indigenous framework. So now I'll discuss a few highlights concerning the actions. So all universities mention the importance of relationship, especially in relation to research. However, only 2 have a position to ensure that work is done, and none of them mention the giving a position of power to a member of the community. So similarly, all universities mention the integration of Indigenous knowledge and revitalization of Indigenous languages. However, only 2 designate a position to ensure that work. So those 2 universities always being Concordia and UQAT. So we can see that designated position is a general flaw in the action plans. However, all actions, how action plans mention having a designated position for support agents and mention multiple forms of support. So for the discussion now, the results confirm that EDI action plans reproduce invisibilization of First Peoples and reproduce inequalities between the 4 groups. So we can see that women's representation has significantly increased, while Indigenous representation is actually decreasing, because even though the numbers have increased a little, their availability has increased more. So this shows how institutional policies application is unequal between the 4 designated groups, where the policies are working for women, but not for the other groups as much, especially for First Peoples. So this highlights how we need First Peoples specific institutional policies. So in terms of history, the majority of the institutions did not clearly state the origin of those action plans. But what I found out is that EDI action plans became a requirement from funding agencies in 2017. And this actually stems from 8 people filing a complaint for discrimination back in 2003. So for the First People's action plans, we can see that Concordia had the most criteria, followed by McGill, UDM, CAT, and Laval, but all of them had quite a few of the criteria. However, Concordia is the only university that respects the 3 conditions for a respectful, relevant, reciprocal, and responsible institutional action. So this shows a major gap between the content of the action plans and the participation, specificity, accountability, and engagement of resources they require. So it seems like institutional actions are reproducing tokenism with a checking the box approach without real transformation of power and colonial dynamics. And indeed, lack of recognition of colonialism was one of the major flaws. So only 2 universities positioned their action plans in relation to colonialism and its impacts, so Concordia and McGill, which underlines the invisibilization of colonialism and oppressions within universities, even when we're addressing their impacts. This invisibilization is also present in the wording equity, diversity, inclusion, which positions the university as promoting social justice rather than addressing the inequalities it is creating and perpetuating. So this constructs the group as beneficiaries, while the privileges and dominant practices fostering inequalities remain unquestioned. So this is also present in the First People's action plans, where actions around offering support to facilitate the adaptation of First Peoples to the institution are more implemented than actions around changing the institution itself, which resonates with the assimilation dynamics mentioned previously. So current institutional actions may also have the negative impact of resonating with a common prejudice of First Peoples as dependent, needy, and using too many resources. Most action plans correspond to a deficit-oriented approach, where most of the focus, if not all, especially for EDI, was on underrepresentation of First Peoples, aiming to increase their presence without recognizing colonialism and racism and without centering the institution's role and responsibilities. So although EDI and First Peoples action plans theoretically aim to address systemic discrimination, they are failing to address racism properly. Anti-racism policies need to state their origin, analyze inequalities in terms of oppression, characterize the groups as fighting oppression, and focus themselves on fighting oppression rather than excess and participation. As I just explained, the great majority of action plans do not respect any of those criteria. So this leads us to the conclusion that universities in Quebec are currently failing at addressing racism and colonialism in their policies. So this review also shows disparities between the universities in Quebec, and this gap seems more prevalent between English-speaking and French-speaking universities. In fact, the education system in general in Quebec presents major deficits in comparison with other universities on Turtle Island, which are mostly English-speaking, creating major inequities for French-speaking First Peoples. Here is a map of the universities, all of them here being in Jojage. So why only Concordia and McGill seem to engage in adequate institutional actions? Relationships may be the cause of those disparities, as the communities closest to the institutions may be determining the efforts happening. So, for example, Montreal is situated here. So between the three communities closest are Kanien'kehá:ka communities, which are in terms of settler languages, mostly English speaking. So this could explain some of the disparities between English and French speaking universities in Jojage. This could also explain why universities with a strong Indigenous presence, leadership, and existing partnerships, such as McGill and UQAP, are cited as inspirations in the literature, despite not fulfilling all the conditions. So this highlights again how the work still relies on First Peoples' shoulders. So this brings us to a last question. If institutional actions require relationships, and relationships can go beyond institutional actions, are institutional actions relevant, or will they always be a performative gesture maintaining inequalities? So although it might seem positive, this actually underlines a major lack from universities who are still not taking their responsibility towards First Peoples. So First Peoples have to act as watchguards, activists, Indigenous experts on top of doing their work and experiencing tokenism, racism, colonialism, and scrutiny. So we can see again how the lack of designated positions and policies contributes to inequalities. So for me, that's why institutional actions are still necessary, as it is the institution's responsibility to take that work, and failing to take that responsibility reproduces colonialism by putting that added burden on First Peoples. This brings us to the key takeaways. So first, institutional action towards First Peoples in Quebec universities are predominantly absent or inadequate, reproducing colonial dynamics. There's still a major lack of recognition of universities' role and responsibilities towards colonialism. Beyond action plans, institutional policies are necessary for holistic approaches and strategies throughout the whole university, as well as recourses if the policies are not respected. I want to highlight that those actions are not a favor or a good action, but simply taking responsibility for our actions and the ongoing colonialism and upholding of white supremacy education institutions are a part of. A central takeaway from this research is that the great majority, if not all, of the decolonizing and indigenizing work is done by First People, and that this work is often invisibilized and not properly recognized and compensated. Of course, that work can be done without First Peoples. However, it is the institution's responsibility to give First Peoples the power, governance, authority, and resources to support and honor that work, ensuring proper conditions for real change. A phrase I often hear from First Peoples is, "We have been saying the same things for decades." It is way past time that we ensure those conditions are met to not only listen, but guarantee a real transformative decolonization and indigenization of our institutions, so that First Peoples never have to repeat themselves again. Thank you for watching. Please email me so I know somebody listened. I'll be really happy to receive any comment, feedback, question, anything. Thank you.